Hey, hey, hey. It's Friday again. We're here with my friends Alex and Askia on the Level 100 Hour. I hope everybody's had a great, productive week. And we've got some kind of carryovers from the last couple of weeks that we've been talking about. But it seems to me that we've been getting pretty deep into this operation of athletics industry and sporting events and how they relate to local governments and some of the politics. And Alex, you were talking about doing some research on teams and learning the politics and history behind sports. What in particular were you looking into? Was it football related or was it baseball
Yeah,
that you started doing the deep dive?
so my two sports are football and mixed martial arts.
Okay.
I've also had interest in boxing in the past, and I also like professional wrestling. I guess technically speaking, that's not exactly a sport, but when we use the phrase sports entertainment referring to
Yeah.
an industrial group, I immediately think of WWE because they insisted on that term for such a long time.
Hmm.
What's interesting is that they're now going away from it and back to the phrase pro wrestling. But at any rate, what I was saying is that anytime a person really gets into a particular interest, and it can be sports, it can be any particular sport, or it could be something else, what they discover is that any activity that has a cultural impact also tends to have a very complex layer of history, and anything that's being done on a wide scale enough to have a professional layer to it has its own economics. And in both of those cases, there's this very interesting subset of politics that happens as far as how governments relate to that activity. So that doesn't just apply to sports, that applies to all forms of entertainment and in this modern day and age, most human activities.
Who, when you say cultural impact, do you mean I
I mean,
think where I need clarification, what does it need what does a sport need to have a cultural impact? I mean, I think there's some obvious, answers here, right? Like football,
well,
there are, seasons that people plan their entire year around, here
right,
in
right.
America. But there are other sports that are not only American based, but I see baseball being that, it's America's pastime. That's kind of their motto. Um, Soccer is an interesting one. I think, you guys touched on the World Cup and the infrastructure that comes to town when when you have the world's audience upon your community, right? So I know Dallas, where I live, is going to have a significant amount of World Cup activity here at the, Cowboy Stadium. And I've been hearing on the media outlets that I listen to, just the amount of work that's going into providing the security detail, the infrastructure, making sure there's enough food, hotel rooms for the amount of people that travel in. But soccer is something that I feel that culturally here in America hasn't had the same significance as some of the other sports. So Alex, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, what does it take for a sport or an entertainment to become culturally significant? Just
Well,
popularity?
I mean, that's an interesting question. And, when I say culturally significant, what I mean is that people watch it, play it, care about it, aspire to play it, aspire to watch it, even,
Hmm.
with the price point for tickets to sporting events these days, actually having the leisure and spending the money to go and do that leisure is becoming aspirational. And as far as the relative cultural impact of different sports, that obviously changes over time and in different societies, because today the NFL seems to be the most popular and most profitable sport in America. And then elsewhere, it's professional soccer. And then in other places, it's Formula One.
Hmm.
And, think about the things that it's not. Time was boxing was what everybody cared about. And today, both boxing and professional wrestling Never mind the transition from legitimate competition to scripted that happened in professional wrestling. But at any rate, both those things have receded and mixed martial arts have come to the forefront.
Mhm.
And so these things change over time. And what's interesting is that the cultures of the societies that are watching or participating in these sports change as the selection of sports changes and as demand rises or falls, the pay scales of those sports change, which then uh, affects the demand in the labor market for a given athlete. And what's interesting, and I'll take the example of boxing, is that today there's pretty much one, maybe two contending American heavyweight boxers. Deontay Wilder, he's kind of on his way down though because oh wait, he's my age. But the other I guess is Andy Ruiz. And then everybody else who has a shot at becoming heavyweight boxing champion is from elsewhere. Now, how did that happen? Well, and I don't think this is anything original on my part. I feel like I read it somewhere. Right about the time that Mike Tyson reached the top of the mountain, the revenue model for boxing switched over from network to pay per view. Result, one of being that the kind of kids who at one point would have been underserved in not so good communities and turning on the TV to discover something else in the world that they could aspire to, no longer seeing boxing. Uh, and for a certain type of athlete who has good size, little fast twitch, good reflexes, can build muscle mass and power, and you're in a place socioeconomically where you're thinking that sports is what's going to get you ahead, what does that leave for you to aspire to in terms of selecting sports? This is an easy one.
Well,
Yeah, I mean,
I
or
think
good. Good,
I
Wes.
was just going to tell a quick story because
Sure.
I kind of got wrapped up in a little bit of the boxing world this
Uh,
week, and it was just through an Uber ride. And like I do, I just chatted up with my Uber driver, always looking for a networking opportunity or a business connect. And I found that Uber rides are a good way to do that because it's typically someone who is aspiring to be an entrepreneur, is involved in other business activities. And it just so happens that the person who gave me a ride home, he was a 25-year-old aspiring boxing promoter, and he interfaced directly with the boxing camp, if you will, and they're planning a boxing ticket here in Grand Prairie, Texas, and he needed some help with promotion, right? And so we just started talking, and I work with a printing company here in Dallas, the oldest printing company, and I said, hey, you know what, I it sounds to me like you're going to need some promotional help with this event, right? And you're going to need to kind of keep the costs down, because a lot of money goes into, you're talking about pay-per-view, and you think about the amount of money that are invested in these events that the promoters are looking to recoup after all the pay-per-view deals are done, the attendance, the tickets are sold. So there's a lot of money and a lot of preparation, and so I think not only from an athletic perspective, but even from an operational perspective, is a good way to get into the athletics industry or just professional sports. And then I have one thing I found interesting while we were just taking a break there, is that the number one sport in the world is soccer, but second is cricket. So we speak from our American perspective. American football is actually down
right.
at number 9 on the popularity, right? So again, this cultural significance um, point of view, I think there's like a bunch of different perspectives on how people find their national sports, culturally significant. And I think popularity has a big part of it, right? Like, do I want to be, the fear of missing out, comes to mind, is like, do I want to be involved in this movement, if you will? Because 2.5 billion people watching a cricket match is pretty significant, and we don't play or watch cricket here in America very much at all.
Well, fair enough, but consider that, and the NFL has its International Player Pathways program, which they realize that people will tune in to watch a local boy made good no matter what country they're in. And so recruiting players from places that don't normally watch the NFL is a good place to turn is a good way to turn those places into places where they'll watch the NFL. However, you'll note that most of the most of the international players, regardless of what country they're from, are either Pacific Islander or West African. And again, we have to ask the question of body types. Now, try not to say anything that is going to be impolitic, but the fact of the matter is there are some shot sizes and shapes of people that are good at some sports and some other sports. I have been watching football for about 30 years now. It's just very rare that, speaking of cricket, um, a few Australians, most of whom are Anglo Australians, pretty much no one from South Asia, and anybody I've seen African has been from West Africa rather than East. And
In
you
the
know,
NFL, you're talking about?
in the NFL, yeah.
Got it.
And it kind of is what it is. The answer to my earlier question, by the way, was football because that's a sport in America for big, strong boys that stayed on network TV.
Yeah.
And you know, it is what it is. And I think the most telling thing about the transition from boxing prominence to football prominence is the fact that most of the sons of professional boxers that you can name were encouraged to play football because, hey, there's good money in it's still brutal, but it's not that brutal. Ken Norton Jr. would be the prime example.
I think this is all really interesting. I mean, I think kind of tying together some threads here. You mentioned the World Cup part of it, and why specifically why Kansas City was chosen goes all the way back to the 2012 World Cup when the United States made its first significant run in I forget like 30 something years. And so Kansas City was, the Power and Light District here was always one of the shots that the national broadcast went to of just people going nuts. So there's definitely a microclimate here in the Midwest of just soccer fans. So even in the MLS, like the new St. Louis City Football Club is one of the most popular teams, and Sporting KC has always had one of the highest attendances for home matches. And a lot of the traveling players, like to come here. There's just quite simply like there's just a lot of people who like soccer here, and then it's interesting for me as basketball guy. One of the sports that's in decline or like non-existent in a lot of parts around here is basketball. And you're seeing kind of adoption of youth sports like specifically soccer,
Yeah.
football, baseball, and then you see swimming, you see some other sports, and then some of the data I shared with you guys about youth sports participation rates, we've seen kind of a decline start to happen there too, which is really interesting because it speaks to a couple things that I think are happening culturally here and may actually like lead to some of the things we talked about in terms of like funding, whether it's youth sports or college sports or professional sports, where now I'm starting to like think like, oh well, if people are doing or participating less in sports and it's less of the culture, whether it's due to lack of access, let's be honest, like playing football and doing gymnastics or travel baseball are expensive. Most families can't
Mm.
afford it. And so you basically like reach a line somewhere around
Yeah,
middle
add
school
hockey
to
to
where
that list.
oh, yeah, that's a big one. So now, like, all
Yeah.
these sports are like so expensive to continue participation at the higher levels that it effectively eliminates, you know, a significant part of the population from participation after a certain age, usually in that like 12 to 13 range. When you start like having to play like year round if you want
Yep.
to like take this seriously.
Well, there's money required of it because there's money in it, you know? And 12 to 13 as athletes start to hit a degree of physical maturity, that becomes the separation as to who's going to continue in it because there starts to be that pathway towards the revenue generating side of it. And not for nothing, even if you are economically disadvantaged, if you have enough athleticism for someone to think that you can have a future in it, someone tends to show up and pony up.
Yeah.
We've all seen The Blind Side or read it or watched the lawsuits about it.
Well, I think the data shows what Aski is talking about. Some of the fastest growing sports in America currently are, pickleball,
Mm,
alpine touring, biking, off
mm.
course golf, which I don't know what off is that like. Is that like
Curveball.
extreme
Is that
golf?
like Fight Club?
Yeah. So I don't know what off-course golf is, but it's had a 67% rise in the last year. Snowboarding is on the rise again. Skateboarding's making a comeback, and tennis is growing. But I think that kind of highlights Askia's point of the barrier of entry is lower for some of these sports, right? Um, in order to play pickleball, you can play that sport on an existing, basketball court, or, it just doesn't take much to get into it. Now, um, basketball, I too am a huge NBA fan. Go Sacramento Kings. I'm going to put my plug in there. They they have a certain degree of athleticism that's required in order to play basketball. I was having the discussion with this guy yesterday. Is boxing, they have different weight classes, so you can kind of be paired up with other athletes that meet
Right.
your stature. But in NBA, it's like being tall is an automatic, kind of entry point. And I think tall people are type of, recruited for their body type, not necessarily for their talent right off the bat, because you hear about these kids in high school, they're like 8 feet tall. And honestly, some of them don't look like they're, in the best physical shape, but they were recruited because they were tall, right? Think of the Muggsy Bogues and who was the other
That's bringing it back.
Webb.
Oh,
But
Nate
Earl
what about
Nate
Earl
Robinson or the
Boykins.
Pearl. Yeah.
Boykins?
Yeah.
Yeah, but what about
Hmm. Spud
Webb?
Webb.
Spud Webb. That's what it was. Spud Webb.
Yeah.
That,
But
go ahead. Those were small
well, I
stature
was
guys that made it, but they had to work
yeah,
extra,
it's
extra
very
hard.
rare. And
Yes.
they were never not defensive liabilities either, because, that's just how it is. And what's interesting is as far as height is concerned, yeah, to have your better shot of going to professional basketball, you're gonna want to be, probably what, at least 4, maybe 5 sigmas above what's expected, unless you're Dutch, and then I guess it's only 3. But I can interestingly, to your point, Wes, I can only think of one Dutch NBA player, Rick Smits, and he was 7'4", which, yeah, that'll make it easier. But it's not entirely height. And some of those kids that you see that have been, recruited for basketball at a high level at an early age, and it's like, yeah, but you're going to have some trouble growing into that body because of, you know, acromegaly or whatever it is. And
Mhm.
that's not a fun life. But and one thing that is interesting to me in America is then the interplay between football and basketball, because there is some overlap of that body type. Not a huge amount, but enough to make an exploration of, you know, risk and reward in the two. And, let me be clear. Once you get above 6'7", if you're having trouble, well, all right, let me back up. The overlap is pretty much athletes who are between 6'4" and 6'7" in height. And the ones that are having trouble putting on weight will go to basketball. The ones that don't have trouble putting on weight might consider football. But once you go to 6'8" or taller, if you can get in anything close to basketball shape, you should consider basketball, because not only do you at that height risk knee injuries in football because everybody is coming low to hit you, but also that the money on an individual basis is just gonna be better in basketball. Caveat though is that there are something like 1,700 NFL players at any given moment, guys that are on a roster, and the number in the NBA is only going to be 450. So,
Yeah. So Good.
There's just so many ways to look at it.
Well, I mean, so one generality I'll just throw out there, the athletes in the United States are just bigger, being one of those
Yeah.
athlete types. I had my choice of, football, basketball, or baseball, but it started early. I grew tall and was always athletic from an early standpoint. And so that further accelerated, my development into all those different things that, really as far back as I can remember, probably really like fourth or fifth grade. Um, and so ultimately, like, even today of like, all right, the baseball players, the football players, the basketball players, like almost every, except for maybe soccer, like being a jockey, um, table tennis, I don't think it matters. There's only a handful of sports that, having large physical size, whether it's, muscles, muscles, or having muscle and or
Well,
height, yeah.
add gymnastics, figure skating, and distance running.
There you go.
Y-
Oh, and then you have the
Yeah.
shadow of boxing.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up boxing again. What you said about weight classes, Wes. Um, Look, we have all appreciated the way that in combat sports, weight classes have split out and then incentivized different fighting styles, which is to say they incentivize different forms of entertainment value. At the end of the day, though, weight classes were originally instituted to provide access because if everything were open weight, then there would pretty much be just one size of athlete, World's strongest man in the open weight division, you need to be at least 6'4", but preferably closer to 6'6" or maybe 6'10", so that you can put on 400 pounds in order to lift 1,000 pounds.
Mhm.
And
Let's call it specifically
you know,
Atlas Stones. Those things are no joke.
Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
like Brian Shaw, the last American world's strongest man, is 6'8". The Mountain, Hathor Bjornsson, is 6'9", and Eddie Hall, when he won it, was undersized at 6'3".
Yeah, but still
So
like,
Undersized.
but still like still 2.5 sigma in terms of like his size or his height, relative to the population here stateside.
yeah, but you could just look at him and then look at Shaw and tell who was having a harder time carrying around 400 pounds of body weight,
Hmm.
even though he was the first man to deadlift 500 kilos, which for those of us in America is 1,100 pounds.
Yeah. And so how would have those athletes done as figure skaters? They they probably would have had a tough time. So I think it's interesting that we're going down this road because, Askia, you've got your, kind of genesis story around sports, and yeah, you're a taller stature person and you fit well with all those different sports that you mentioned. Me personally, my journey is I've always aspired to be a basketball player. I absolutely love basketball. I have from an early age, but I've attended basketball camps and I haven't been very good at it. I tried, I practiced, and I studied, but I haven't been good at it. Now I got roped into kind of going the baseball route because I'm a stockier build and I can just crush the ball. Like I can smack it. And that was, kind of ordained for me, if you will. And that's the route that I took. Granted, I played a little bit in school and mainly played in adult league softball for primarily my time playing the sport. But I think the barriers of entry is the overall theme here of what we've been talking about, right? And um, there are other way, say you don't or get injured or you don't really have the body type for the sport that you're interested in pursuing. There's a lot of other jobs within that vertical, for working for that company, if you will, or that team. From there's just so many different skills required to support that organization, whether it be the ball club, directly, or an individual athlete, or an association that oversees and keeps the scores and keeps things fair, because there's some levels of governance. It kind of goes back to this, governance theme that we've been talking about for so long. Is there's got to be rules, there's got to be, um, ways to enforce said rules, change rules, adapt to new ways of playing the sport. I was curious that esports didn't come up at all during this discussion. I thought for sure esports, because I remember drone racing. I thought that was going to be it. Like I thought that was the what everyone's going to be watching in the future. And quite honestly, it's just kind of fallen off, right? It's just not that interesting to people, because it's it was maybe cool for a couple of races. It's just not that um engaging. I don't know what you guys think about that, but robotic sports I think is something we might see in our lifetime. We're already seeing the drone racing, but
Mhm.
you know, I they already have some of those robot competitions where the robots have to like kick a ball into the goal or follow a line quickly. But as these robots become more and more sophisticated, they're going to be able to field a catch or
Mhm.
pitch a ball, and that'll be very interesting where that goes. And I think that that's how technology is going to disrupt sports, if you will, in the robotics area.
Well,
Yeah, that's
there's always gonna be somebody trying to promote a new type of spectacle. And you know, we even have lived long enough to see them come and see them go. Think of arena football or American Gladiators. There's a good one.
Yeah, I remember
And
American Gladiators. I loved American Gladiators.
yeah, that was
for
yeah.
for uh, for every CrossFit games, there's this, there's High Lie, which was a little before we were
Highlights that.
born,
Hey,
but
if you want to make some
they
money,
definitely tried for a minute with that. And there's kickboxing, which had its moment, and there's arena football, which gave us a lot of things, but doesn't look like it's going to be giving us anymore.
wait, the arena football league's going under?
I mean, I don't think it's gone under, but they let Antonio Brown buy a team and run it into the ground, so I don't think it's what it used to be.
No, no. I mean, they're still around. It looks like it's just they're definitely not. Well, so all this centers around attention,
Hmm.
and I think the attention is so fractured across the pop. I mean, there's definitely sports that are growing in popularity and whatnot. And so, you guys talked about the drone racing league or the DRL. You also have the pickleball league. You also have the cornhole league. You
Don't
have all
forget
these.
Power Slap.
Oh, power slap! Yes, yes. How can you slap? But so there's all these different like interests that or like sub genres or like like it's all populated. And so Wes, you mentioned the esports stuff. I mean, I was way ahead of my time because we were, world enough to where it was like highly discouraged to spend that much time on video games. And now it's like if you don't have 18 hours a day on console, like or on the computer, like you're trash. You
I
know.
missed that train. Yeah, we definitely missed that train, but that's
No,
okay.
no, we were early. We were early to the station, is what
We were
happened.
early before. Yeah, I would say we were early to the station playing a little bit of games, and then the train left, and we were still back playing, our arcade games or Mortal Kombat or
Yeah.
whatnot.
Yeah,
Well,
and so
everybody who wins the classical music competition is either Korean or Georgian. Georgia the country, not the state.
right.
And it's a similar type thing because if you're not spending that time practicing the thing, then you're not going to be the guy. Sports, at least, there are physical limits and diminishing returns to what you can do. So that's something.
Yeah, I mean, even you see, even in the esports, like there is a predominance of youth. Like even like being in your 20s is too old. Especially
Mm.
for the fast switch games like, real time shooters or strategy games or, like the amount of coordination and thought. And I mean, it really lends itself well to business eventually once you know, kind of leave that arena. So leave the esports arena and go into the business world. There's just so many, kind of applications of having, that great hand eye coordination and quick and accurate decision making ability. Um, Especially if you're going to cross over into like investment banking or day trading or some of those other things. And so like to a certain extent it's like, all right, like in the data that we see that people are playing less sports, are we actually counting these alternative or like these newer sports like competitive scenarios in those numbers, or are they excluded still? because I think to a certain extent now that like robotics competitions are part of most STEM curriculums across the country, at least for high schools that care about the future of their students, or even the drone racing league, which would be another piece of that, or some of these other pieces. And so now it's like, okay, we're definitely seeing increased participation in these non-physical, because let's be honest, and these schools are getting laid out, and they get knocked out if they slap in. Yeah.
Well, what we're talking about, and I think both of you touched on it already, is barriers to entry is not quite the word I want, but capital commitment, right?
Mhm.
Attention is becoming fractured because barriers to entry to publish and distribute have gone down. Like you can get eyeballs on things probably today more
Mhm.
easier than any other era previously. And so if you can get people to watch, if you can at least be putting out a broadcast of something, then the question becomes, what does it take for people to understand what they're seeing and get interested?
Mhm.
And esports, I mean, the cost of having a game to play is externalized to the game developer. All you have to do is show up and play it with, some kind of rights agreement, I guess, to the game studio. Power Slap, capital commitment a little different because it's someone's face. And then drone racing, you know, finding whatever size tract of land makes a good course, and then doing what you have to do to produce that broadcast. That's probably pretty expensive relative to the others. And all the while, if it's a new thing, you have to evangelize it to people. So I don't know. I think, given everything I just said, I think the CrossFit Games is probably a pretty interesting case study. Likewise, the X Games.
Yeah, the X Games are kind of a modern day Olympics and success story, but even the X Games are kind of falling off in, popularity each year. That's why I was trying to find out what sports are gaining in popularity, because you don't hear about a lot, new sports being created, if you will. The power slapping thing is newer, but what's your what's your lifespan going to be in a, what's your career going to look like in a power slapping league? I doubt that some of those guys faces look like raw meat after the match.
Yeah.
I would
And what's
imagine.
interesting is that among slap fighting promotions, even yeah, there's more than one, which means that
Mhm.
there are different approaches and there's competition. And I've definitely seen members of one criticize the other for, hey, you're supposed to enforce rules about leading with the fingers rather than the palm, because if you're just going to have a contest to see who's going to palm strike each other until they knock each other out, you're going to get knockouts. But that's not healthy at all. And it's like, well, no, but
By the way,
yeah,
the
it's
one historical note: the X Games is already 31 years old. Is a thing.
what?
Yeah, I mean we're
Wow.
getting old, man. I mean that's why I
I
was
do
like,
feel old.
X Games is not new anymore. Like 30 years
No.
of X Games,
That's wild.
and then
How old are the CrossFit Games?
I think they're already like 12, 13 years old.
That
And
sounds
what's
about right.
CrossFit Games? Is that like that Tough Mudder thing? I've never seen the CrossFit
No,
Tough
Games.
Mudder's separate, but there's a lot of crossover.
CrossFit is basically well, I know you've heard of the workout, but
Yeah, I know what CrossFit is, but they,
they
have
have a
gyms that compete.
competition. Yeah, they have a competition where you win your gym and then you win your region and then you go to the national and world CrossFit games and then you do these workout feats of strength that are based around things that are interesting to CrossFit people. Like, can you do a clean of this significant but not world record weight however many times, and then do a handstand walk over to this place and climb this rope? And yeah. And so, it's the best athlete in the world who isn't already doing Olympic lifting, powerlifting, strongman, NFL, UFC.
So it's highly subjective and highly debatable. I mean, I've just got stories of competing, back in my more athletic days of, CrossFit athletes were always like the most like they had decent bodies, but they were usually trash at whatever sport I was competing against. So it just for whatever reason those skills just did not translate well into the actual like hitting a ball, catching a ball, shooting a ball, running over a motherfucker with well, that was you know.
Live TV, ladies and gentlemen.
I can edit things out, but
Well,
yeah,
yeah,
we're not live.
people who missed the train for other sports came to physical culture later in life for whatever reason, with very little besides their type A personality. And I don't know, CrossFit as a training modality, I don't necessarily have great things to say about, because I know you can get in good shape doing it, and some of those people do pretty amazing things. But at the same time, like anything, there's the ones you see who are the haves, and then there are the have-nots that you don't, who ran afoul of the injury rate behind high frequency and highly technical movements.
Yeah.
So,
I
you
think
know,
CrossFit is a business model more than anything, for people to start up classes and get people to sign
mm,
up subscription. It's a money making endeavor, because a lot of those exercises, let's face it, you can do it in your living room, but it's really getting to do that with a group of people. And yeah, like you said, most of my friends who've tried CrossFit ended up getting injured within like a short amount of time of doing it, right? And bad injuries too, like broken fibulas and stuff like that, or they missed the jumps. It seems to me
mm,
like when they push themselves too far, right, where they're trying to do a vertical jump on those risers, and they
right.
get a little too high, and maybe that's lack of supervision, really, because I,
Mm.
I I know you kind of just get access to the gym at a certain point, and it's like, hey, do your own workouts. I- but I'm just sitting here brainstorming. It's like, what will the future of sports be? Because a lot of these established sports are trying everything that they can to build their popularity, right? Like NBA is doing this play-in thing, which I'm not a big fan of, but it's obvious they're trying to get more viewership, by making it more exciting, or just making it more inclusive. I'm not real big fan of the play-in stuff, but again, I'm happy. I enjoy watching basketball on TV. It's a fun thing for me to watch. And baseball, I don't like watching baseball on TV. I think it's boring, but I love going to a baseball game, in person. I don't know how you guys feel about that. NFL, I think it's fun to go to a game in person or watch on TV. But there's some smarts that are involved in knowing the rules to the NFL, before I think you fully can enjoy it. My wife is kind of an example of that. She got really into NFL this last year because the Niners were doing well, and she started understanding the rule sets. And there are some things that happened during the Super Bowl where I wasn't able to explain it to her, and I said, "I'm not exactly sure how overtime works right now, honey. They just changed that." So,
Yeah.
um,
Well, the guy said it. We're going to play a new game because the overtime rules had just changed last season,
yeah,
specifically for the Super Bowl. So
Yeah.
they basically
Well,
like, you're good.
I was just gonna say, it's interesting. Yeah, the complexity of the rules in American football. I was reading an article said one of the best moves that they made in the last 25, 30 years was to start using the graphical first down line, because that made it easy to say to a first time viewer, okay, they have 4 plays to get across the line.
Yep.
and
And so so that like integration of like technology
boom,
into sports. So yeah, the first down line, like in hockey, they tried to do the glowing puck, but that like was cool for a little bit, and now you don't see it
mm,
anymore.
yeah, it was annoying.
Baseball, there's a major piece of like the traditionalists who don't want to see things like pitch clocks and um, in automated strike zones and things like that. And meanwhile,
Mhm.
Angel Hernandez still has a job missing
Yeah,
the most middles like in umpiring history. And so
yeah,
so the top level threat of sports entertainment, because everything that we've talked about is sports entertainment, as an
right.
industry, as the individual pieces. And so one of the things that you mentioned the Super Bowl. A lot of what gets discussed and what keeps this interesting and kind of gives it more of that WWE factor versus like true like competition, in my personal opinion, is the fact that we as or the leagues themselves have fiduciary responsibilities to themselves, to lots of other people, to be able to like effectively make as much money as they can, even though almost all of them are nonprofit organizations. And so
Right.
that's it, in Sacramento. I mean, this is well documented case of the Kings versus the Lakers in 2002. Where you
Mhm.
basically had the officials rig the game to make sure that the Lakers won.
Yeah, and you see it even in sports where you would think you would not see it because look at Chuck Liddell's UFC championship reign, and you look at who he beat, and it was basically people who, as long as he could not get taken down, he could outstrike them and knock them out, and that's exactly what he did till he ran up against Rampage Jackson, who turned out to have sharpened up his boxing while he was in Japan, and that went not so well for Chuck.
Yeah, and so the term in college football is cupcakes. You got all
Yeah.
these cupcakes that to build people up, and then when it's time for like the top competition, you've been eating cupcake instead of like eating meat. You know,
Also known as the plot of Rocky 3.
you so
Is
true.
that the Russian one? Is that where he went to Russia?
No, that's
Oh,
Clubber
that's
Lang.
I thought it was Mr. T.
Well, yes, that's
That's
his
his
name, but
character. Okay,
yeah,
I need to rewatch Rocky
Clubber
3.
Lane.
Clubber Lane. Okay, I need to rewatch
Yeah, that was a
Rocky 3.
Yeah, it's a good
great.
one. That is a good one.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that one in a while.
I haven't seen that one in a
hmm
long time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's funny because just for shiggles, peep the transformation of Stallone's physique from the second movie to the third one, and then don't ask any questions.
Or how he's still able to do what he's doing at 70 something.
Yeah. Speaking of technology and sports,
Yeah, yeah, the whole bio side of it's really amazing. Well, I mean, you
that's
see the
wild.
longevity of
Yeah.
players. I mean, that's actually it depends on the sport that we're talking about because on the one
Mm,
hand, longevity in baseball players, specifically pitchers, is at
mm,
all-time lows. Those guys like
yeah.
50, 100 years ago, their arms are just made of something else because they could go pitch
Right.
100, sorry, they could throw 100 pitches and then 2 days later come out and do it again with no arm
hmm
issues, no Tommy John, and no rest, and then of course, but it goes back to like sports are so different now from a
hmm
training and a preparation and nutrition and sports science and medicine and all these things that we now have that are part of the game. Um, let alone the analytics side of this of like you need to have a very specific arm angle when you're throwing a
Right.
football or you're throwing a baseball or you're shooting a jump shot over someone or you're all these different things. And so to a certain extent, it's like even for a technology enabled you know person who's used it in proliferates it as much as I can, like the purist of me that lets it slip of just like sometimes I just want to knock an mf'er out, like
And
that
the
part
thing
of
is,
sports. Like
yeah, the thing is that what gets measured gets managed. We've all heard that one.
mhm.
And 2 out of 3 people on this call are MIT alumni, and that was Alfred Sloan that said that, right?
Yeah, but it's the eye test versus
But
the data, and
and the point
the
I
eye
was
test
making was not
wins.
just to the point I
Yeah.
was making was not just to dump on Wes for not going to the best college in history, but what I'm
It's okay.
saying is that once you start measuring something, you start trying to optimize to it. Could you imagine trying to watch an NFL broadcast in like 70s and having people, you know, do the whole snap to pass clock for like Fran Tarkenton and being like, well, what's he doing? They would have probably drummed a lot of that game out of him and we would have been the poorer for it. And I remember reading a LinkedIn post a while ago, and they were talking about how James Harden was a example for what was happening all across the economy because you know it turns out the most effective thing you can do is drive and penetrate a few steps, pull back, shoot a fadeaway jumper, and draw a foul. It's just that nobody enjoys watching that, and so you have a James Harden economy where everybody wants to do the best practices, nobody wants to deviate, and everything is pretty premium mediocre. And
So the word is
I think we
innovation.
had,
That's what's missing, and that's why
yeah.
innovation, the wild type factor. I'll use a biology term.
Hmm.
Like that's why I'm pro eye test over the data, because the reality is, like, I mean, you can go back to the Dodgers World Series when maybe 2 years ago when Dave Roberts left his guy in because the data said to do it. The guy was gassed. Like, you could tell it. Like, he's throwing meatballs. You got to pull the guy. But that's the whole, like,
Right.
the knowledge and the experience part versus the data. Because if I just want the robots to make all my decisions, then why do I need managers, coaches, or any of that stuff? But the reality is,
Yeah.
like, the players play. I want my players to make plays, and especially in
You know.
basketball. And this just drives me nuts what the game is now. Because the reality is,
Hmm.
like, anybody can camp and shoot 3-pointer. Freaking Peja Stojkovic, he camp and shoot 3-pointer. Sasha Vujacic, I camp and shoot 3-pointer. And it's like everybody can't shoot 3-pointer, and then everybody jacks these Steph Curry shots, and it's really, like, completely corrupted the game in ways that I think are going to make it to where there's a reason why it's unwatchable, and there's a reason why nobody likes the All-Star game and nobody likes the playoff basketball playing games and all that. It's because the product, the quality of the product is just kind of crap, in my personal opinion. Like, it was better, and yeah, I sound like an old head, but at the same time, like, there was just a lot more that went into it, you know, to play it in the legacy style. But then again, so there's like this whole style play thing, and that happens in every sport or every competition of, like, how somebody does it. And that's one of the things that keeps the sport alive, is like the purity aspect of, like, oh, this person does it the right way, or they do it the wrong way, or they're a villain, or they're a hero, and all these other themes that kind of get to play out in front of us.
Right. I mean, what we're describing is, the ways in which, and this applies to almost everything in human life. Basically, everything you participate in is has a potential to turn into the ship of Croesus on you. As far as and the ship of Croesus, because I'm a nerd, is it was a hypothetical, it was a thought experiment that if you take a ship and you replace one part on the ship, if this goes on for an arbitrarily long time, eventually you'll have replaced every part of the ship. And at that point, is it the same ship? So, if we, in our, as we're all around 40 years old, have been watching sports for 30 years, and this part of the presentation was changed, and this part of the rule set was changed, and that made this type of athlete to be incentivized, and now the coaching is done this way as opposed to that way. And at a certain point, it's like, wait, am I watching the same thing as I was watching when I started watching it? And sports rise and fall in popularity, and so for some people, the answer is no.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that, about how I mean, because we're going through those transitional phases right now in multiple, sports, if you will. Um,
Hmm.
we're legacy, stars are being replaced by the new crop. I mean, I think at the end, I'll pick on the NFL in particular. This whole Patrick Mahomes arc. Because I live here in Kansas City and I'm a Raider fan historically, and I also have affinity to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and I also have love and hate for different teams across the league depending on whatever. But I renounce all my fandom because I participate. I work in sports entertainment for certain organizations. So, but at the same time, it's like, all right, well, is this actually, like, the product that people want to see? Because, like, the Patrick Mahomes thing, he was anointed basically when Tom Brady started declining and the Patriots dynasty started falling apart. And now it's
Hmm.
like, all right, well, now we're trying to build to these, like, new prototypical quarterbacks. But at some point, I come back to the biology wild type factor. Like, this cat's different. His dad was a major league pitcher. Well, how many,
Right.
like, dudes have that, and then come up and have that as, like, the basis for, like, developing their arm talent and arm strength, let alone then apply the football, pieces that he got growing up in Texas, which, that's, so you have a lot of, like, what, I mean, I know you, Alex, you're not the biggest fan of the book Outliers, but it really does apply here.
I mean, no, the book's fine. I don't know. Malcolm Gladwell in general is a little lo- what's the word I'm looking for? He's like the what's I can't think of exactly what I'm trying to think of.
Well, there's a
I don't know.
business
He's
book
kind
that
of.
also applies here too. Like, and I can't remember the name of the business book, but, like, the how we exactly got, Bill Gates and, Mark Cuban, and, like, these,
Mhm.
when you look at the origin stories of like, well, this is why the analytics are effectively a digital way of trying to represent an analog world, and the analog world are these pure signals of the right combination of things, that the flower and the crack of a sidewalk in the hood or whatnot. Like how
Right.
do you get those?
Yeah.
You know,
I
you,
have
you,
it. Malcolm Gladwell is like the Chrysler 300 of public intellectuals. It's like, this is luxury, and then you're like, is it?
I'm laughing because I had a friend who had a 300, but like when we were in our 20s, he had the car because that was like he spent 30 grand instead of like 18 to 24.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it looked cool and everything, but then as soon as you started like going below the surface, it was like, yeah, okay.
And starts falling apart and the bumper
Yeah,
falls off.
Cybertruck.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think, even more instructive than Mahomes as to what you're describing is Josh Allen. Because you know, there was a guy who people just could not wait for that GM to get fired because of him, you know?
Hmm.
They're like, I don't know what he sees, but he's gonna regret this. And then for a couple seasons, it was like, yeah, maybe. And then suddenly he turned a corner, and now it's like, here's the heir to a bigger, faster, more accurate, and yes, accurate somehow, John Elway. And it's like, yeah, we will watch that. We will pay to watch that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to pick on Justin Herbert here because ultimately, I think I've been on this stump in this soapbox for quite some time, thinking he's overrated. But now he's going to have the best coach he's ever had. But a lot of what got the previous regime for the Chargers fired is the fact that they choked off multiple times. But that's like the history of the Chargers is choking in big situations over
Uh,
historically.
well,
Um,
speaking of somebody who went so hard on next gen stats that he got himself fired, Brandon Staley.
yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the day, like the TLDR being, you play to win the games. You don't play to
Yep.
manage the numbers or whatever. Like
Yeah.
that's trash. That's just garbage. Like nobody
Well,
really wants to watch that. You know.
and yet it's the way of humans and everything to just keep fixing it until it's broke.
Well, I mean, hence what we were before the stream started. We were talking about economic development and whatnot, and we're definitely at a crossroads here where at some point you have to replace. Like it becomes so expensive to just continue to put lipstick on it or to duct tape or WD-40 that or you have enough issues that those things can't fix it anymore. And we
Hmm.
effectively have like because the whole thing has been replaced. It's not the same. From an integrity standpoint, it's not the same thing, and you have this different thing that's usually a fraction of the original design or spec that's more or less been like cobbled together to replace the original over time. But at some point you have to start with just like wild type again.
Hmm. Well, what happens is, you know, there is basically there's like a cognitive pattern in people to try and reduce something to like the barest indicator of what it is and still recognize it. And so there's an incentive to turn something into the simulacrum of itself, and then tell people, yeah, this is the thing. And they're like, uh-huh, why is it, not as good as it used to be? You see it,
Exactly.
I don't know. The one thing you see it with that really annoys me is Five Guys.
Oh goodness, that place used to be so good. But like
Uh-huh.
now, like they're probably five, pun intended, 5 guys or 5 years away from not existing anymore. I mean, paying $30 for, you know, for that
$30 for,
per
a
person.
not very good, not very big burger compared to what it used to be, and then like the bag of the greasiest fries of all time that I don't know. They're not what they used to be either.
No, they're
I
not.
don't know.
Well, I mean, you just reach a price point where like how many people can afford a
Mm,
$30 meal? And if you're eating 3 times a day, which is, of course, doctor recommended, not my recommendation, but I'm not a
nah,
doctor.
me
I'm
either.
also not making a recommendation. I don't want anybody getting in trouble for eating too much or too little here.
Right.
Everybody's dietary needs are specific, and they should consult their physician before before making such important decisions and changes. And that is not
Yeah,
me.
don't just go up or down a weight class on our advice. Or it could,
Yeah. Are you saying that eating Five Guys for 3 meals a day is probably not a good
oh,
decision?
oh,
That
yeah,
sounds like a
Financially or from a health or nutrition
Mhm.
standpoint.
well, I'm gonna
But
bring up a new sport.
what's interesting about that is that you know, people do manipulate their price point to right size their demand. And what's also interesting is, just because the pie grows or shrinks for a single transaction doesn't mean that they're not also playing a longer game of optimizing their lifetime value. And given our earlier comments about attention being split, that's something to consider too. And the example I like for that is WWE, because in absolute terms, there are fewer people watching today than there were 25 years ago, and yet earnings, which are of course reported by a publicly traded company, which it has been for about 25 years,
Mhm.
have just continued to go up and up. And the math doesn't math unless they are getting more dollars out of each set of eyeballs than previously.
Yeah, and you talk about the split attention. I mean, this is where YouTube and the internet and the whole like you could basically broadcast it yourself. I mean, you can low budget create your own sports league, and if you have decent production quality because you have an iPhone and a streaming service, you really can all of a sudden have your dodgeball matches on your Facebook page. Which for those I love all my dodgeball videos are still up there. You can watch me just
Ayo.
use my physical advantages of my wingspan and my strength and size and athleticism and intelligence and intuition and all the other things that allowed me to execute the 5Ds better than all those DSs. Yeah.
You're sounding like Kurt Angle for a second. Intensity, integrity, and intelligence.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of like the dodgeball league in Sacramento used to be more of like a very co-ed like social thing, and then it became like hyper competitive, and now the league's almost gone. Everybody got old,
Uh,
and nobody. It turns out that the younger generation. See, I guess here's another canary in the coal mine. The generation of people in Sacramento behind, that came behind us are effectively like, I don't want to play competitive dodgeball. It hurts, and so
yeah.
they'd rather play off course golf. Which hey, off course golf is a good thing too. Like I like simulators and top golf, but nothing replaces the real thing. In my
Is that
personal
what off-course golf is? Is like Top Golf?
Yeah,
And
I had to just
okay.
learn that in the background while we're streaming here. So
Wow. Okay.
Just don't, speaking of professional sports, drink and top golf and then drive your new Corvette 156 miles an hour into the back of some poor girl and her dog.
you talking
Oh
about
no.
Rasheed Rice or some other dude?
No, Henry Ruggs.
Oh yeah, goodness, yeah. There's that. That was terrible.
Was that in
Yeah, that.
Nevada?
Yeah, that was what 3 years
Yeah,
ago.
yeah, that was, yeah, 2 or 3 years ago. And how many first round picks from that draft are still on the Raiders and did not commit any crimes?
It's like negative, but that's like most.
Raider
that's
drafts.
that's a whole nother. I mean, that's a whole nother thread. Probably the top level is I think there's a lot of public opinion that's especially for the pro athletes that have the means, whether it's from NIL deals like women's basketball. And I mean, Caitlin Clark just signed her deal with Nike for like 8 figures, which is like
Yeah.
her career earnings from the WNBA will come nowhere near that. You know,
Mm.
like
And
she may be the
people,
first. Or good.
oh, nothing. Not sure if I should say what I was gonna say.
Besides the fact that she's mid and doesn't play defense, so is that what you're gonna say? Because that's what I'll say.
Well, I was gonna say that people are up in arms about her salary, and they keep making the comparison to Victor Wembanyama,
Oh,
and
yeah.
nobody wants to talk about some of the economic realities there.
How the
And
league is still exactly subsidized by the NBA still.
yeah, and I have no dog because I don't watch men's or women's basketball. But when I read a couple of years ago that a game had to be forfeited because they were still flying commercial, it was like, ew, maybe there's not a whole lot of money in this.
Well, I mean, it's one of the biggest hypocrisies that exists in our culture today. Of
Mhm.
so who watches women's sports? Well, I do. I've watched for 15, 20 years, as far as like whether it's soccer or basketball, because for you guys know me well. I love competition. Absolutely, it's a big part of why I've been successful in life. It's because I love me some competition. You know,
And
it's
women are extremely competitive in their sports. Go watch a women's softball game and
Mhm.
oh yeah,
see levels
Or
of
s-
competitiveness.
and every few years there's a women's college soccer game where one girl is straight gooning. You can, and it's like that doesn't happen by accident.
nah, nah. The going ignorant is kind of part of the deal. But I mean, especially in softball too. Like you want to talk about like the competition parts of there of like you watch especially I mean your underhand, granted it's the windup and whatnot, but you still have like reaction times equivalent to or exceeding Major League Baseball in terms of like what you have to do
Yeah,
in order to make contact. Let alone the fact that like these girls that have been doing it for 15 years of their life get so good at it that I mean, they throw dots. If they want to
yeah,
put
for
it right
sure.
between the one and the one of your if you're number 11, that's exactly where that ball is going to go, and you will be bruised.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, for sure. And there are sports, softball being one, gymnastics uh being another, and there was a third one. But there are sports where in absolute terms the technical level is higher on the women's side than the men's.
mhm.
Those are the ones that tend to get watched the most. And then there are others in which the competitive spirit really shines through. Um, that'd be martial arts. And I don't know, I got into rock climbing briefly, and one of the things that really stuck out to me, other than the fact I needed to lose weight, was that women climb completely differently than men and are frankly smarter about it because men pretty much forget they have legs
Yeah,
and try to King Kong everything.
yeah,
It's
weight
like, huh,
distribution.
Well, that's what
that
happens
other
when you're physiologically different and you don't have the upper
Hmm.
body strength and mass.
Yeah,
but like anything, it's not systemic malice. I need to make that point. I know I guess that makes me
It's
getting
not.
political, but
No, you're not at all, and
you know,
I'll support that because it goes back to the hypocrisy comment I made. You want to know who's not watching women's sports? Women. Make that make
right.
sense.
And it's not as like I'm pretty sure Caitlin Clark is gonna do pretty well for herself financially in the next few years,
Oh,
even if
already
her
is. She's already a multimillionaire.
official salary is not what some people think it should be.
Hmm.
Um, Ronda Rousey went from Dana White saying I'll never promote women's MMA to whatever large amount of money she made over those years. And
Yeah.
people were people were happy to watch her and found the merits of what that product was. uh and yeah, every athlete, once you're at the professional level or the revenue generating level, then yeah, you're a product.
Yeah, it's gonna be really interesting. I mean, well, even look at it just the NCAA basketball. Like the women's had more viewership than the men's this year. So at some point, like
Hmm.
we're reaching these like inflection points of of interest, shifting. But again, another piece of American culture that's obviously at play here is our split attention span and our inability to
Yeah.
stay focused over a long period of time. And so, yeah,
hmm
women's basketball is having its moment now. Let's see if that translates, in 35 days to the start of the WNBA season. Let alone let's see it sustain itself over a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
you know People will watch what you make them watch or what you give them a reason to watch. And Ronda Rousey, for instance, I guess there were people who wanted to make the case about sexism in regard to how her career went, but at the same time, she definitely drew more money and eyeballs than someone like Demetrius Johnson, who he was the men's flyweight champion, actually in the next weight class down from where Ronda was, and despite the fact that he was head and shoulders again ahead of the game for years and years, they couldn't make any money off. They ultimately they let him go from the promotion while he was still champion. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. So, as much as people want it to be about prejudice, it's not. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to make a bold prediction here and say there's a chance Caitlin Clark comes out ahead in the stack of Zion Williamson. Because,
Really?
yeah, I know he's got a bit of a head start based on that first contract, but I hope he's going to manage his personal finances a little bit better than his physique.
Nah, he's still slinging seed all over the country, and he had that
Yikes.
pregnancy scare and a few other things.
Yeah,
But I mean,
and speaking of differences in body types as they develop longitudinally, I remember I remember 5 years ago when he was in his last NCAA tournament. I guess it was his first and last. But when he blew up his shoe trying to make a cut and jacked up
yes,
his knee,
that
and
was
everyone was like, he's such a big and powerful athlete that even the shoe technology can't contain him. And I was saying to myself, look, if he's 19 years old and weighs 285 pounds and only has to play in 35 games in a year, what's it going to be like in 10 years when he's 29 and has to play 82 to 100 games? He's going to have to lose some weight.
yeah. Yeah, that
And
goes that really does
this
tie
has not
together
happened.
the thread of body type and optimal
Hmm.
body types for specific sports. And he's definitely a guy that his body type is way more conducive to playing football, specifically like D end.
Mm.
Like he would have been an amazing D end.
Yeah, he could have easily gained like 15 pounds and been Richard Seymour.
Yeah,
So a 3-4 defensive end specifically for people who are not football nerds.
3-4, huh? You don't see him as like either will or you know
I
in
mean, to be a
4-3.
4-3 to be a 4-3, so edge rushers,
Oh, I guess that would have
in
been
a
a
four,
linebacker as opposed to a D end.
yeah. Well, in a 3-4, the edge rushers are going to be the outside linebackers.
Right,
But
4 OBs, and I mean, but then they transition to that 5-2 nonsense you see a lot more of these days
and
when nobody runs the ball.
a 4-3 defensive end is always slightly smaller than a 3-4. A 4-3 defensive end would be like, I don't know who's the best one right now. Max Crosby. Well,
Oh, oh
yeah.
no,
And
they don't play. Oh, well, that's right, they did shoot 4-3. Yeah,
a 3-4 defensive end would be someone the size of JJ Watt.
yeah, makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
Wes, anything you wanted to add? I know we're approaching time limits here.
Yeah.
I definitely don't know players as well as you guys do, and I learn a lot from these calls, whether it be financial markets or different perspectives on sports. I think it's a very interesting thing how we organically arrive to technology's impact on all these different areas of everyday life. You don't think of sports being something, sports entertainment, right? Live entertainment, definitely. um, and there's been some artists coming out. Coachella just happened, and I think second week of Coachella, and there's been some artist interviews that I've heard of the impact of live streaming and being able to have access to professional live broadcasting tools, and AI is going to change the every industry,
Mhm.
and artists are very much aware of it, and they're excited about it, scared about it. I think it's just this big unknown, and as we continue to talk, Askia kind of opened up the call, or like, what are the trends that you're seeing out there in business right now, Wes? This was before we kind of started the feed, but um, I think this awareness is what we discussed, is this inflection point that many of us feel that we're at, and just being able to um, be aware of how many aspects of AI or technology are going to affect as we move forward and enjoy the world around us, right? Um, I have all these thoughts that come to mind because I'm a big dreamer, right? And I was like thinking about like, well, what is the future of sports going to be like? You know, it, NBA is one that I watch the most, and uh, technology wise, I don't think there's a lot of advancements that have been made in the production value, if you will. Granted, I think the pandemic and the remote um, viewership of keeping the league going right through a natural disaster like a pandemic was intriguing. But I liked your point of talking about shoe technology, right? Like
Mhm.
I think for the NBA and ball technology too, right? You see that Spalding, I don't know that
Oh, do you remember a few years ago when they tried to switch the ball
they
and
did
like
switch the
the guys
ball.
were getting like cuts on their fingers or something?
I was
Yes.
just gonna say that, right? That thank you, Alex, for saying that because I was going to bring up that point is that advancing things for the sake of advancing them aren't always the right choice, right?
For
And
sure.
it compromises integrity of the game.
Hmm.
You start thinking about doping and some of the biological training that people are doing. That's cheating. It's straight up cheating. Well, you're kind of nodding your head like, is it?
Well, well, there's
Um,
money in it, and that's why they do it.
yeah,
And to
Well,
be clear,
yeah.
and this is not condoning the use of performance-enhancing drugs. I'm just saying the reason people do performance-enhancing drugs is not to work less; it's actually to work harder. uh, the advantage that it changing your endocrine profile gives you is that you can take more volume and recover faster. And that's why you end up bigger and stronger. Now, whether or
okay,
not your tendons and skeletal structure can take it, different question. They
okay.
can't.
Well,
But
barrier of entry. Not everybody have access to those treatments, dude. So it's like,
well, fair enough.
it's like
Yeah.
some guy that is born with some talent for whatever sport he's into, and then he's going to compete against like Rocky 4. He's going to compete against this guy that's been in Russia training with the most technologically advanced training equipment, gets beaten by a guy that's out there pulling sleds in the snow. um you know so I think it's going to
Well,
be interesting to watch these things unfold, and I'm curious at where the intersects of technology and sports are going to take us, right? Like I
and
think it's going to be fun.
yeah, for sure. And it's interesting because it differs by sport too. Like,
Hmm.
I don't think Jim Brown would do all that great in today's NFL necessarily. However, I think you could pull like Nate Thurmond into today's NBA and he'd be fine. Yeah, I don't know if I have the
Yeah.
exact
I
I
don't
don't know
know
if I
who
have the
that
exact
is.
comparison, but
No, no, that's I mean, again, it come it's tough. It's always, comparing age generations is just one of those things where I just can't, quote unquote, because the games are different. The rules are different, the games are different, the players are different, the bodies and like everything's different. So it's really hard to do. And I
well,
think
what I'm
it's
saying is that
yeah.
I think the physicality in the NBA is changing in a slower degree than it did in the NFL.
Hmm.
And
Well, in terms of recency, yes, because the NBA did their stuff, you know, 20
mm,
years ago, that changed the game and made it softer and in a lot of things. Whereas the NFL is like all of a sudden in the last like handful of years, like we don't want our players dying and committing all this other stuff. Like, oh, we're gonna make all these changes. Now we're gonna play flag football in a year. Oh,
mm,
sorry. Oh yeah, no hip drop tackles or whatever. Anyway, the top level thread I
yeah.
wanted to get back to of the intersection of technology and sports. So that's been there for quite some time.
Mhm.
Especially as we what does the future hold? Well, I mean, like you guys said, it depends on the sport. And so I'll tell you about the basketball side of the future of technology. Simply put, that's probably the one place where we're going to see, in my personal opinion, the least impact. Why? Because it just comes down to simple, like in terms of the mechanics of like shooting a parabola through the torus, because that's all you're doing, or just putting the ball through the basket in simple terms. Like that math is very simple. It does not change.
Right.
There's
Uh,
just certain positions on the court that are advantageous, either right by the basket or camping 3-point line.
Mm.
That has always been the case. Like mid-range jumpers, because different like schemes, whether it's zone or matchups or double teaming or whatnot, you'll still have some exceptions of that kind of stuff. But like the reality is, like the game of basketball is in its purest forms doesn't need to. It won't change, and technology is not really going to enhance it. It's going to only help us understand it better for the layperson who hasn't played 20, 30, well, in my case, 35 years of basketball. Now you come to football, yeah, it's there's football is definitely a sport that's been and will continue to have technology directly integrated. I mean, even the fact of like you could watch video in real time on the sideline, like that little innovation alone has completely changed how coaches prepare and call games, and it really even further highlighted like the coaches that can make in-game adjustments versus like halftime. You still see the halftime adjustments too are major, but the ones that can do in-game adjustments based on the chess match that happens between what the offense and the defense call, like that evolution is going to continue to spiral and is really interesting to watch. um from baseball standpoint, you know we definitely it will, that part of the game, the technology, again, it's more of the awareness part of it, because we're artificially placing limits on the technology of baseball. Whether it's like you can't use you can't use certain spikes, or you can't do this, or you can't do that, or bats are effectively fixed to material and type, and baseballs are made by one company to a very specific, standard that hasn't changed or is only changed every so often. And so it makes it
Yeah.
really challenging. But then you look at a sport like tennis, who's like not only adopted technology, but they embrace it and they lead with it. In terms of the timing, did it hit the net? Did it, in and out calls? So they've gone in that direction, and that helps the watchability of the sport, because now there's more integrity because of the technology that exists there. And probably one of the
Right.
most contentious places of technology in sports is soccer. Like that is that's gonna start World War III maybe. Like
Yeah.
it's pretty wild.
Well,
Your
I think
fans
what's
are pretty
interesting
aggro.
is that the introduction of technology into a sport can actually cause the forking of a sport into two different sports. You know, bodybuilding and powerlifting being two good examples of that. Basically, speaking of PEDs in bodybuilding, the level of muscularity that it became possible to reach, depending on what you're willing to ladle into your body, got to a point that aesthetically, um, demand for attention started to go down, as in people were not cool with seeing people that muscular anymore, men or women. And on the women's side, yeah. Um, and so men's bodybuilding added the classic physique category, which is how Chris Bumstead, who you've probably heard of, got to be famous. I guess he's the most famous currently competing bodybuilder. And classic physique is, people are still on stuff, but they've dialed it back to the level of size that maybe people were in like the 70s. And given that you need to not get too big, then the game and the strategy and the tactics change. And then in powerlifting, it's the difference between equipped and raw powerlifting. As I guess the compression suit that you wore to prevent injury got made of tougher and tougher material, and actually gave you some rebound out of the bottom of the lifts, then that started to increase people's totals, such that the difference between the equipped bench world record and the raw is something like a factor of two almost. Which, why would you do equipped then? That's cheating. Okay, if that's what you think, fine, but everybody knows the rules. Moreover, the advent of equipped lifting actually helps to progress the raw bench record.
So
So
just so we're all clear, what is a quit? Are we talking like gloves and straps and stuff like that?
So I think, I mean, it differs by federation and it differs by lift, but I think wraps at your elbows or knees or wrists are not considered equipped. I think a belt is pretty conventional, but specifically a squat or deadlift suit or a bench shirt, I think, is what qualifies as equipped.
I
Well,
mean,
I'll make a
go ahead,
prediction
Wes.
here. I
Yeah.
think individual sports like deadlifting are going to rise and team-based sports are going to decline. And I think the reason that is social media, right? And the ability to get a following as an individual athlete, because you see people deadlift online all the time. I was going to actually ask you guys, like, when you brought up deadlifting, is like that is seems to me like an extremely popular thing these days. Seeing women deadlift and um, it just fills my social media feed these days. And I think, wait a second, what are, what am I looking at? I don't know.
Cake. You looking at cake is what you looking at.
Oh man.
Wow.
Talk about deadlifts. You building cake. That's what is going on.
Several
Yeah.
layers, like a 5-layer cake. Um,
Um,
but I was just making the point that it kind of dovetails off of what Alex said earlier. Is everybody having access to these media platforms now? You could basically become a deadlifter with a following online and have a means to support yourself deadlifting by yourself. No need for team trainers. You can be self-sustaining. You could be entrepreneurial if you build a community around that. Bodybuilders, the same thing. There's that young kid, and I'm just bad with names, but I think his name's Chad or something like that. But he is just
Sorry,
not.
that
that's
is.
that
Oh,
that's a
that was
little
too
on the
hilarious.
nose, isn't it?
Yeah, hold on. I don't think that's his name. I'm gonna have to look it up. But my
Does he
point
date
is,
Stacy too? I mean,
my point is that he has a successful career and he's a bodybuilder that has built a strong social media following, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know that he enters competitions or anything like that, but
Oh.
he builds his physique online in a gym, publicly to his
You talking about
audience.
Sam Sulek?
Sam, that's who I'm talking
Yeah.
about.
The
Sam.
guy who's on so much stuff that his skin is like falling apart off his body and he's gonna die soon.
He's young and I don't know that he's going to die soon. I didn't know that he's on a bunch of enhancement.
Well,
um
is he the guy who is huge and young and has long hair, but like
yeah,
his
that's him.
skin is very
Very
noticeably
bad.
terrible?
Yeah,
Yeah,
he's got really
that'd
bad
be
acne.
that'd be the steroids.
Okay.
yes.
Well,
Do you remember Rich Piana?
no.
Well, he's dead. So
Oh
anyway,
yeah, he's the guy that would like make those shakes. He was like huge, really
he,
big guy, and he had
uh-huh.
the tribal tattoos and kind of
Yeah.
the faux hawk, and he was like making these mixes. He's like, you can't eat these mixes because like there's so many grams of caffeine, it would kill an average person, but I'm going to go ahead and have five
Yeah.
of them.
He was like openly on so much stuff, and yes, to include the stimulants and whatever else
Yeah,
that
I know what you're talking about.
even people who were fine with being on stuff were like, dude, that's too much stuff. You're gonna die.
And
And
he
then he
died.
did. Yeah.
So much gear, so much stuff.
And
Well,
so what I wanted to make this point before we get out of it.
sure.
That technology and demand are doing to sports what they do to everything, which is three things. One, that the price of mediocrity goes continually down, which is fine for a TV, but less good for something you are going to watch on the TV. Two, that the accessibility of a certain level gets wider, which means that the quality at that level goes up. And we have seen that in many sports over time. World record progression is a good example. But three, that with those two things, the price of being excellent goes continually up. And so that's how you start to get into these weird situations where people are sacrificing their long-term health for the sake of greatness. And it's very interesting to watch. And all the time, everybody who is watching is trying to derive some kind of personal or cultural lesson from it. And that's the other layer that makes it interesting. And you can absolutely, on that score, see what you want to see because we're all old enough to remember when Lance Armstrong was a national hero. That's
Yeah.
no longer the case.
Well, that comes back to well, I mean, obviously in his case, he was on the sauce. You
Mhm.
know,
Mm,
and it was illegal at the time of consumption. But I think one of
yeah.
the challenging things I have of like, I mean, the, what creatine and vitamins and basically everything but like steroids and the cream or the clear itself were lots of things that
Ayo.
were that were accessible to those of us in the world of competitive sports in the 90s. um and like it was a very clear line, like don't take shots in the ass, kids, like just don't. That stuff messes your body in ways that you never
Not that
want to
clear
do.
though, because pro hormones were not illegal at that time.
Well, HGH and TRT and stuff like that was like,
Uh,
you're right. Those things. I mean, this is one of the biggest debates in baseball. I'm the fan of let most of those guys in, not all of them, because there's some of them that did
mm,
do illegal things. But for the
yeah.
ones, so there's always this comes again. It always comes back to the
Well,
governance, right?
people acting like Barry Bonds did such a horrible thing, as though the pitching he was facing didn't have access to the same things. And
Exactly.
Roger Clemens definitely did,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, most of those guys. I mean,
because you'd
also
be stupid not to.
also
If there's
noted the
that,
use of amphetamines.
hmm
To get up for games. I mean, greenies. I mean, greenies are greenies. Greenies are
yeah,
great. They have these things by like the punch bowl. You could go in there and get some greenies, and you got a day night back to back. You're playing 2 baseball games in 12 hours. Yeah, greenies.
I think
right.
the Barry Bonds thing is a little silly. I don't think he should have. Did they ever put like an asterisk on his ball in the
No.
Hall of
Yeah, the
Fame?
guy,
But, well,
well, the guy who bought the
Echo,
ball, I know, and I stopped
Mark
wearing
Echo.
that stuff at that time because that was stupid.
So he bought it's in a private collection. Mark Echo still has that ball.
Makes
which
sense.
ball?
The
Barry
number
Bonds,
seven, number
his
756.
his home run ball.
Well,
Yeah.
713.
I thought it was 756.
That's Hank Aaron's ball.
I think that's the one he bought.
And
No, he bought Barry Bonds ball.
Yes, I'm saying that
He
to
bought
pass
the
Babe
one.
Ruth you have to get to 715. To pass Hank Aaron, you have to get to 756.
Yeah, and I think Barry Bonds did that. And then
Yes,
whatever the ball was,
yeah,
that's what I'm saying is
762.
that
No, you're right.
but
It's 762. My bad.
okay. That's the one that Echo bought. Did he buy number 756 or number 762?
don't know.
Really not
Uh,
important.
yeah, that might be something for our viewers to look up
Mm.
in their spare
No,
time.
756 is Mark Echo, but I don't know who owns 762.
I think the Hall of Fame. But
Makes sense.
you know, kids, people, you can be a museum curator, okay, for the Hall of Fame, Baseball Hall of Fame, if you want to, and you can decide what
Uh,
artifacts are in your exhibit. I think this was a very fun discussion for me because I think we were all you know having fun with the conversation a little bit. I think it's always good to have this kind of tie back to how level 100 can help our learners, if you will, our learners donation, our constituents. And me personally, I think the message that I would hope to get out there to the masses is that athletics is definitely a place where if you are in a bad um, area in your life, athletic programs are available throughout America, and I recommend that people join them and get the most out of your peers and the social aspect of that. But sometimes you don't have the right body type. Sometimes you don't have the right skill set to get into that athletic program that you were trying to get into. But there's a lot of other areas within the sports world and entertainment world, both from a technology standpoint, a promotional standpoint, a you know regulation standpoint, a medical standpoint. There's a lot of areas as a vertical that people can pursue and have very successful lives. And all of us have our experience with watching and playing sports, and I probably don't apply it as much as I could, um, to my everyday life. So I think that was a takeaway for me, is how I can use some of these sports philosophies to get business wins as well.
Mhm. And yeah, value, once it starts being created, it creates its own sort of horizontal and vertical integration around itself, so that there are other opportunities to create value. Like Wes was saying about other professions that are related to a given sport. And on the same note, just on a very real and individual basis, I want to encourage anybody who's watching this to find something you can get into, by which you can get out of your mind and into your body and discover what it can do and how it makes you feel, because that'll be good for you in a very, very real and compounding long-term way. And so I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I mean, that's the name of the org. It's level 100.
Yeah.
Find something that you want to be level 100 in. You know,
Hmm.
um, and obviously, like, we were talking a lot about sports, and the price and the sacrifices of getting to level 100, and the decisions you make or don't make. We could probably have just an entire series on that alone. But the point that Wes brought up, and one of the things that my life definitely like double check or double clicks on, is that I've been able to take the lessons of being a dominant athlete for a long period of time, and from it's the name of a lot of my companies, Alpha Baller. There's a mindset, there's a physicality, there's a commitment, there's sacrifice, there's all the different things, and that'll come out in different places. But ultimately, that's a lot of how I think and a lot of how I relate to it. And yeah, you can call it, Michael Jordan's killer instinct, or the Mamba mentality from Kobe Bryant, or Tom Brady's whatever he brands his stuff. But there's a very specific set of lessons that you learn playing competitive sports, either as an individual or with teams, that are really applicable for life. Um, whether you're trying to get to level 100 in sport, you're trying to do it in business, you're trying to do it in technology, you're trying to do it in whatever you decide to do. That's the whole point of this, is how do I get to level 100 in your chosen discipline or areas of life, and figure out how to do it ideally, ethically, and responsibly. Is really kind of the piece of it for me, of like, there are lots of shortcuts or cheats or buffs or other non-acceptable practices that could have been implemented to get here. But it definitely means less when you turn on cheat codes and things like that, and you just don't get the same validation, let alone respect, let alone like longevity, um, by getting there in artificial manners. But
Well,
Wes,
thanks,
if you wanna,
Askia. Yeah, I think that's a good place to kind of take us out, until next week. We thank you for your viewership, and continue to like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. We're going to continue to have these kind of free flow discussions, topical. But I really appreciate everybody's time, and I look forward to future conversations with you guys. I hope everybody has a great weekend and a productive start to next week.
same. Thanks everyone.
All right.
See you guys.
Yes,
Bye, guys.
thank you.